The encrypted radio messages crackled through the humid air of Pearl Harbor on May 28, 1942, carrying secrets that would reshape the Pacific War. Commander Joseph Rockford hunched over his desk in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, his bloodshot eyes scanning intercepted Japanese communications that spoke of something called AF. For weeks, his cryptanalysts had been piecing together fragments of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan, and now the picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. Their naval forces had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, conquering the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma with seemingly effortless precision. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Kido Butai, the elite carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, continued to dominate the seas from the Coral Sea to the Indian Ocean. Emperor Hirohito's forces controlled an area larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But beneath the surface of Japanese triumph, cracks were beginning to show. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May had been tactically inconclusive, yet it marked the first time Japanese naval forces had been checked in their advance. More importantly, it had cost them valuable pilots and aircraft they could ill afford to lose. The Imperial Navy's doctrine of aggressive expansion was beginning to strain their resources. Though few in Tokyo were willing to acknowledge this uncomfortable truth, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, understood better than most that time was running out. The American industrial machine was awakening from its peacetime slumber, and soon the Pacific would be flooded with new American ships, planes, and trained personnel. His window of opportunity to deliver a knockout blow to the United States Navy was rapidly closing. The plan he conceived was audacious in its scope and complexity. Operation Me would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto would deploy nearly the entire combined fleet in a carefully orchestrated attack that would capture Midway and destroy whatever American naval forces came to defend it. With the Pacific Fleet eliminated, Hawaii would be isolated and vulnerable, forcing President Franklin Roosevelt to negotiate a peace that would leave Japan's Pacific Empire intact. According to a comprehensive analysis published in the Naval Institute Proceedings, Yamamoto's confidence stemmed from his belief that the Americans still possessed only 2 or 3 operational aircraft carriers after the losses at Pearl Harbor and in subsequent battles. Japanese intelligence estimated that the Enterprise and Hornet were the only American flat-tops available in the Pacific, with the Lexington sunk at Coral Sea and the Saratoga under repair after torpedo damage. What they didn't know was that the Yorktown, despite suffering significant damage at Coral Sea, was being rushed back into service through round-the-clock repairs at Pearl Harbor. In the shadowy world of signals intelligence, Commander Rockford and his team worked feverishly to unravel the Japanese code-designated JN-25. They had achieved partial success in breaking the naval cipher, enough to understand that a major operation was planned for early June. The mysterious AF appeared repeatedly in intercepted messages, always in the context of the primary target. Through careful analysis and a brilliant deception operation involving fake water shortage reports, Rochfort's team confirmed what they suspected. AF was Midway. The stage was set for the most crucial naval battle of the Pacific War, though neither side fully grasped the magnitude of what was about to unfold in the waters around a small atoll that most Americans had never heard of. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before the massive plotting board in his Pearl Harbor headquarters on May 27, 1942, studying the intelligence reports that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The soft-spoken Texan had inherited command of a shattered Pacific Fleet after the Pearl Harbor disaster, and now he faced the greatest gamble of his career. Everything Rochefort's codebreakers had told him pointed to a massive Japanese assault on Midway, but acting on incomplete intelligence could prove catastrophic. The Japanese plan, as it emerged from the intercepted communications, was breathtaking in its complexity. Admiral Yamamoto would split his forces into multiple groups scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention northward, while the main striking force approached Midway from the northwest. The first carrier striking force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would lead with 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soryu, the same vessels that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Supporting this aerial armada would be a formidable array of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, including Yamamoto's flagship, the massive battleship Yamato. The invasion force, carrying 5,000 troops, would follow closely behind to occupy Midway once the defenders had been crushed. In total, the Japanese would deploy over 160 ships and 700 aircraft in the largest naval operation since Jutland in the First World War. Against this overwhelming force, Nimitz could muster only 30 ships and roughly 300 aircraft. The heart of his defense would be 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet, from Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, and the hastily repaired Yorktown from Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17. The Yorktown's participation was nothing short of miraculous, damaged so severely at Coral Sea that Japanese pilots reported her sunk. She had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a list, and massive holes in her flight deck. The shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor performed what many considered impossible, working around the clock in 3 shifts. They welded steel plates, replaced damaged sections, and restored the carrier's fighting capability in just 72 hours. Normal repairs would have taken 3 months, but time was a luxury the Americans didn't possess. The Yorktown would sail with civilian contractors still aboard, their welding equipment and tools scattered throughout the ship. Intelligence gave the Americans their greatest advantage. While Yamamoto planned his operation, assuming complete surprise, Nimitz knew not only the Japanese objective, but also their approximate strength, timing, and approach routes. This knowledge allowed him to position his forces northeast of Midway, where they could launch surprise attacks on the Japanese carriers, while remaining hidden from enemy reconnaissance. The American strategy was elegantly simple: avoid the Japanese battleships and focus everything on sinking the enemy aircraft carriers. Without their flight decks, Yamamoto's massive fleet would be blind and vulnerable. But executing this strategy would require perfect timing, exceptional courage, and a considerable amount of luck. As June approached, both fleets steamed toward their destiny around a tiny atoll that would become one of the most famous battlefields in naval history. The Japanese sailors were confident, having tasted nothing but victory for 6 months. Many expected the operation to be completed within days, with minimal losses. The Americans, still stinging from defeats across the Pacific, knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they possessed 2 crucial advantages their enemies didn't know about: superior intelligence and unshakable determination. The die was cast, and the Pacific War was about to reach its turning point in the waters around Midway Atoll. Dawn on June 4, 1942, broke clear and calm over Midway Atoll as the first Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon like a swarm of deadly insects. At 6:30 in the morning, radar operators on Eastern Island detected the incoming formation, 108 planes, from Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, approaching from the northwest at 15,000 feet. The Battle of Midway had begun. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the Marine Air Group on Midway, scrambled every available fighter to meet the attack. 26 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats climbed desperately toward the approaching enemy formation, their pilots knowing they were outmatched by the superior Japanese Zeros. The American fighters were swept aside like leaves in a hurricane. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 defenders had been shot down, their sacrifice buying precious little time for the defenders below. The Japanese bombers, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, descended upon Midway with methodical precision. Dive bombers screamed down from high altitude while horizontal bombers approached at medium level, their payloads aimed at the airfield, fuel dumps, and defensive positions. The attack lasted 30 minutes, transforming the peaceful atoll into a scene of smoke, fire, and devastation. Hangars collapsed in sheets of flame. Fuel storage tanks exploded in towering pillars of black smoke, and the runway cratered under the impact of 500-pound bombs. But despite the impressive destruction, the Japanese attack had failed. In its primary objective, the airfield, though damaged, remained operational. More critically, most of Midway's aircraft had been launched before the attack began, sparing them from destruction on the ground. The American garrison, though bloodied, remained defiant and capable of continued resistance. Lieutenant Tomonaga, surveying the damage from his bomber, made a fateful radio transmission back to the Akagi. There is need for a second attack. This message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history, for it set in motion a chain of events that would doom the Japanese striking force. Admiral Nagumo, aboard his flagship Akagi, faced a crucial decision. His orders from Yamamoto were clear: prepare for a possible engagement with American naval forces. Half of his aircraft had been retained aboard the carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically for attacking ships. But Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway presented a dilemma. Should he launch his reserve aircraft against the island, or hold them in readiness for enemy warships? Unknown to Nagumo, American carrier aircraft were already airborne and racing toward his position. At 7 o'clock that morning, search planes from the Yorktown had spotted the Japanese fleet 100 miles northwest of Midway. The message crackled across the airwaves: enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180. Admiral Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17, immediately ordered Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16 to launch a full strike. The American attack developed piecemeal, as different squadrons departed at various times and altitudes. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese fleet first at 9:20 in the morning. Waldron's 15 obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers approached at low level without fighter escort, flying directly into the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the entire Japanese fleet and the combat air patrol of circling Zeros. The massacre was swift and complete. One by one, the slow, lumbering Devastators were shot down, their crews fighting desperately to reach torpedo release position. Waldron's plane was among the first to fall, the squadron commander dying at his controls as his aircraft plunged into the Pacific. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been destroyed, with only Ensign George Gay surviving in the water. To witness the continuing battle, similar fates awaited Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. The American torpedo attacks achieved nothing, except to draw the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and scatter the enemy fleet formation. But these sacrificial attacks had served an unintended purpose. They had set the stage for the most decisive 30 minutes in the history of naval aviation. At 10-20-4 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty pack Ific Ocean, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels and no sign of the Japanese fleet. Leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise, McCluskey had been searching for over an hour, following an incorrect heading that had taken his formation far from the enemy carriers. With barely enough fuel to return to the Enterprise, he faced the agonizing decision to abandon the search or press on, and risk losing his entire squadron. Then McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed, its wake cutting a white line across the blue water. The ship was the Arashi, which had been depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. Following his instincts, McCluskey led his dive bombers along the destroyer's course, gambling everything on this slender thread of evidence. At exactly 10:26, the Enterprise bombers crested a cloud bank and beheld one of the most spectacular sights in naval warfare, for Japanese aircraft carriers spread out below them in a perfect box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu lay virtually defenseless, their combat air patrol having been drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks. At that same moment, by an incredible coincidence of timing, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown appeared from another direction, targeting the fourth carrier. The Hiru, Admiral Nagumo, had made his fatal decision 30 minutes earlier, convinced by Tomonaga's report that a second strike on Midway was necessary, and believing that no American carriers were in the area. He had ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with high-explosive bombs for another attack on the island. This decision created chaos on the Japanese flight decks, as ordnance crews frantically worked to change the armament on dozens of aircraft. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes meant for attacking ships were stacked on deck, while high-explosive bombs were wheeled out from storage magazines. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Attack! Attack! The dive bombers rolled into their attacks, screaming down from 14,000 feet at 70-degree angles, their pilots fighting to keep the wildly maneuvering carriers in their bomb sights. The Japanese ships twisted desperately, but the laws of physics favored the attackers. A ship needed 37 seconds to execute a complete turn, while the diving bombers needed only 25 seconds to reach their targets. From the moment they pushed over, the first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26, penetrating the flight deck near the amidships elevator and exploding among the rearming aircraft below. The blast ignited aviation fuel and ammunition, turning Nagumo's flagship into a floating inferno. A second bomb struck moments later, ensuring the carrier's doom. Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered the ship abandoned as fires raged beyond control, the heat so intense that the ship's steel plates glowed red dot simultaneously. The Kaga suffered 3 direct hits that transformed her into a blazing wreck. The largest of the Japanese carriers, she had been Nagumo's primary strike platform, but now her massive hull served only as fuel for the flames consuming her. Explosions rocked the ship as stored ordnance detonated in a chain reaction that lifted entire sections of her flight deck into the air. The Soryu, smallest of the 4 carriers, took 3 bombs in quick succession that penetrated her thin armor and exploded in her hangar deck. Within minutes, she was burning so fiercely that her crew began abandoning ship. Only the Hiru, positioned slightly farther north, escaped the initial American attack, her lookouts having spotted the incoming dive bombers in time to sound the alarm. In the space of 6 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning hulks, their seasoned air crews dead or dying in the flames. The carefully planned Operation was collapsing, but Admiral Yamamoto was still unaware of the disaster befalling his striking force. Radio communications from the battle zone had ceased, leaving the combined fleet commander in ignorance of the catastrophe unfolding 100 miles away. The precision of the American attack had been devastating, but the battle was far from over. The Hiru remained operational, and Japanese naval doctrine demanded that even a single carrier continue fighting until the last aircraft was expended. The morning's triumph would soon be tested by Japan's desperate counterattack. Aboard the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge watching his dreams of Pacific conquest disappear in towering columns of smoke and flame. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the destruction of his carrier force, but Japanese naval tradition demanded that he fight on until the last possible moment. As fires raged through his flagship, making further command impossible, Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, determined to salvage something from the disaster. The Hiru, under Captain Tomio Kaku, had escaped the morning's devastation and now represented Japan's only hope of striking back. At 11:10, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from her deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi with orders to find and destroy the American carriers. The aviators flew with the desperate courage of men who knew their homelands. Fate hung in the balance, their aircraft representing the last offensive capability of the once mighty Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown was coordinating the American response to their stunning morning success. 3 Japanese carriers were burning, but intelligence reports indicated a 4th enemy flattop remained operational somewhere to the north. Fletcher launched a search mission to locate the Hiru while keeping his remaining aircraft ready. 2. Strike. The battle had reached a critical juncture where a single mistake could reverse the morning's gains. At 12:10 in the afternoon, Kobayashi's formation spotted the Yorktown steaming at high speed 20 miles south of the burning Japanese carriers. The American ship was conducting flight operations, recovering the dive bombers that had devastated Nagumo's force just hours earlier. Her combat air patrol of 6 Wildcats climbed to intercept the incoming attack, but they were overwhelmed by the Japanese formations. Approaching from multiple directions, the attack on the Yorktown developed with the same precision that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war. Kobayashi's dive bombers pushed over from high altitude, while his escorting fighters strafed the carrier's anti-aircraft positions. The ship's radar-directed 5-inch guns opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of flak, but the determined Japanese pilots pressed their attacks through the defensive fire. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, killing dozens of men and starting fires among parked aircraft. The second bomb struck near the island's superstructure, destroying the radar installations and communication equipment. The third hit aft, damaging the steering gear and slowing the ship's evasive maneuvers. Within minutes, the carrier was dead in the water, listing to port and burning from stem to stern. But American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew fought the fires with methodical efficiency, while repair parties restored power and patched the flight deck with steel plates. By 1:40 in the afternoon, just 90 minutes after the attack, the Yorktown was steaming at 20 knots and conducting flight operations. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots observing from a distance, she appeared to be a different, undamaged carrier. This misconception led to tragedy for the second Japanese strike. At 2:45, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters from the Hiru in what would be the final attack by Nagumo's air fleet. Tomonaga, who had led the morning strike on Midway, flew despite a damaged fuel tank that made his return unlikely. His aircraft limped toward the target, leaking precious gasoline into the Pacific wind. The attack on the Yorktown was pressed with fanatical determination. Japanese torpedo bombers approached at wave-top level, their crews knowing that survival was impossible, but honor demanded they strike the enemy. Before dying, Tomonaga's bomber was the first to fall, shut down by anti-aircraft fire just as it released its torpedo. The weapon ran true, striking the Yorktown amidships and flooding her engine rooms. This time, the damage was too severe for immediate repair. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship as the Yorktown took on a severe list that threatened to capsize her. The crew evacuated in good order, but their ship was finished as a fighting unit. The Japanese had scored their only significant success of the day, but the price had been the complete destruction of their striking force. Of the 28 aircraft that attacked the Yorktown, only 3 fighters and 2 bombers returned to the Hiru. The Dragon had struck its last blow, but now American vengeance was approaching from the northwest, where dive bombers from the Enterprise were already searching for the final Japanese carrier. At 3:30 in the afternoon of June 4, 1942, Admiral Raymond Spruance faced a decision that would determine whether the morning's stunning victory would be consolidated or thrown away through reckless pursuit. Standing on the bridge of the Enterprise, the methodical former cruiser commander studied the tactical situation with the cool calculation that had made him one of the Navy's most promising flag officers. 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, but the 4th remained operational and dangerous. More ominously, Admiral Yamamoto's main battle force, including the massive battleship Yamamoto, was approaching from the west with enough firepower to annihilate the American fleet in a surface engagement. The temptation to press the attack was overwhelming. American search planes had located the Hiru steaming northward at high speed, her deck spotted with aircraft preparing for another strike. But Spruance's conservative instincts warned against dividing his forces or pursuing the enemy too far from Midway's protective air cover. The Japanese had demonstrated throughout the war that they were most dangerous when cornered. and Yamamoto still commanded overwhelming surface superiority. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise toward the Hiru's reported position, flying through scattered clouds that provided concealment from Japanese combat air patrols. The formation included planes from the morning strike that had been hastily rearmed and refueled, their pilots exhausted, but grimly determined to finish the destruction of Nagumo's fleet. At 5 o'clock, they spotted their target 15 miles ahead, the Hiru racing northward with a screen of destroyers, her flight deck busy with preparations for a final desperate strike. Captain Kaku had launched his remaining aircraft in a forlorn hope of damaging more American ships before his carrier was inevitably destroyed. Only 6 bombers and 4 fighters remained operational, barely enough for a single attack. But Japanese naval doctrine demanded that he fight until the last aircraft was expended. As Gallagher's dive bombers approached, the Hiru was almost defenseless, her combat air patrol drawn away by the launch operations. The attack began at 5:05, with the Enterprise bombers rolling into steep dives. From 14,000 feet, the Hiru twisted desperately to avoid the plunging bombs, her captain ordering hard rudder turns that sent spray cascading across her flight deck. But the American pilots had learned hard lessons about dive bombing accuracy during the morning attacks, and their aim was deadly, for bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, the explosions ripping through her thin flight deck armor and detonating among the aircraft and ordnance stored below. Within minutes, the Hiru was transformed from a functioning warship into a floating inferno. Fires raged through her hangar decks as aviation gasoline fed the flames that reached temperatures hot enough to buckle steel bulkheads. Captain Kaku ordered his crew to abandon ship as the carrier's magazines began exploding in a series of devastating blasts that lifted entire sections of her superstructure into the air. The pride of the Imperial Navy was dying in agony, her death throes visible from 20 miles away. As the sun set on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo surveyed the destruction of his once mighty fleet from the bridge of the cruiser Nagara. For aircraft carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were burning hulks drifting helplessly on the Pacific swells. More than 300 aircraft and their irreplaceable aircrew had been lost in a single day, losses that would take years to replace, even if Japan possessed the industrial capacity to do so. The carefully trained pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months were now dead, their expertise dying with them in the flames of their carriers, according to records maintained by the Naval Historical Center. The Battle of Midway represented the first decisive defeat suffered by the Imperial Japanese Navy in over 3 centuries. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound, shattering their confidence in the doctrine of aggressive carrier warfare that had brought them such spectacular early victories. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving news of the disaster aboard his flagship Yamato, immediately ordered a general withdrawal, recognizing that his grand strategy had collapsed beyond recovery. The battle was not yet over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. American industrial might and strategic intelligence had combined with exceptional courage and precise execution to achieve one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The rising sun of Japanese naval power was setting forever in the waters around a tiny atoll that most Americans had never heard of before June 4th, 1940. Dawn on June 5th, 1942, revealed a Pacific transformed, where the previous morning had seen the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful striking force, steaming confidently toward what they believed would be an easy victory. Now only burning hulks and oil slicks marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru drifted as flaming wrecks on the calm seas, their destruction representing not just a tactical defeat, but the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato received the final reports of the disaster with stoic resignation. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood better than anyone that Japan's window of opportunity had closed forever. The combined fleet still possessed overwhelming surface strength, but without carrier aviation to provide reconnaissance and air cover, his battleships were blind giants vulnerable to submarine attack and land-based bombers. The dream of forcing America to negotiate a favorable peace had died with Nagumo's air fleet. At 6:10 in the morning, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the end of Japan's Pacific offensive. Operation Me is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. Immediately, the message crackled across hundreds of miles of ocean to stunned commanders who had expected to be occupying Midway by sunset. Instead, they found themselves retreating from a battle they had been assured was already won. Their confidence in Japanese naval supremacy shattered beyond repair. The human cost of the defeat was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had perished in the flames of the four carriers, including many of the most experienced pilots. In the Imperial Navy, these were the men who had perfected the art of carrier warfare in the skies over China, who had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack, who had swept British and American forces from Southeast Asia with apparent ease. Their loss could not be measured merely in numbers. It represented the destruction of an entire generation of naval aviation expertise. American losses were comparatively light but deeply felt. The Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, finally succumbed to her wounds when the Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed her while under tow. The carrier that had fought so gallantly at Coral Sea and Midway slipped beneath the Pacific swells. On June 7th, taking with her the destroyer Hammond, which had been providing assistance. But even this loss could not diminish the magnitude of the American victory. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's shipbuilding industry, already strained by the demands of supporting operations across the vast Pacific, could not quickly replace the lost carriers. More critically, the trained aircrew represented an investment of years that could not be duplicated. Japanese pilot training programs, designed for a short war of decisive battles, were inadequate for the prolonged conflict that Midway made inevitable. Admiral Spruance, in his post-battle report, captured the significance of the victory with characteristic understatement. The enemy appears to have suffered a decisive defeat, but privately, he understood that June 4th had marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. American industrial production was reaching its stride, with new Essex-class carriers already under construction and pilot training programs expanding rapidly. The initiative had passed permanently to the United States. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory vindicated his faith in intelligence and his willingness to gamble everything on the codebreaker's analysis. The Pacific Fleet commander issued a congratulatory message to his forces that acknowledged both their achievement and the long struggle ahead. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. The way to Tokyo has been opened. The statement proved prophetic, as American forces would indeed fight their way across the Pacific to Japan's home islands. But the road would be long and bloody. The Battle of Midway's conclusion marked more than just a tactical victory. It represented the moment when Japan's Pacific Empire reached its high water mark and began its inevitable recession. The rising sun flag would continue to fly over vast territories from the Aleutians to the edge of Australia, but never again would Japanese forces advance with the confidence and momentum that had characterized their early war conquests. The precision and hidden intelligence that had guided American actions at Midway would become the template for future victories, leading ultimately to the surrender ceremony aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay 3 years and 3 months later. In the waters around Midway Atoll, where the coral sands had witnessed the turning of the Pacific War, the setting sun on June 7, 1942, illuminated an ocean that would never again be dominated by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The empire of the rising sun had begun its long twilight, hastened to its conclusion by American courage, intelligence, and the deadly precision of dive bombers screaming down from a cloudless sky.